January 1945. The air above eastern Germany is the color of ash, a silent grey that hangs over fields already carved by months of retreat. What was once the pride of Hitler's war machine now sits scattered across frozen airstrips, burned-out Messerschmitts, abandoned Focke-Wulfs, and pilots too exhausted to lift their helmets, let alone their morale. A thin layer of ice clings to the wings of aircraft that will never fly again. Ground crews move slowly, not because of the cold, but because they know the truth. Fuel is nearly gone, spare parts are non-existent, and the sky, once owned by the Luftwaffe, now belongs entirely to the Allies. Somewhere in the distance, the rumble of American bombers becomes a steady, growing roar. It is no longer a surprise. It is routine. They come unopposed now. A young German pilot watches the formation appear above the clouds. He doesn't even reach for his cockpit ladder. He simply stands there, breath forming small clouds in the winter air, realizing what his commanders understood far too late. The Luftwaffe has not fallen in a single moment. It has fallen because of a chain of catastrophic blunders. To understand how the Luftwaffe reached the point of collapse in 1945, we must go back to the decade before the war, to a Germany still bruised by the Treaty of Versailles. Officially, the nation was forbidden from having an air force. Unofficially, however, the rebuilding of German air power had already begun. In hidden hangars, in covert training programs in the Soviet Union, in glider clubs that doubled as pilot schools, Germany quietly prepared for a future conflict long before the rest of Europe realized what was happening. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, he inherited this underground foundation. But under Hermann Goering, a World War I ace and one of Hitler's earliest loyalists, the Luftwaffe rapidly emerged from the shadows into one of the most modern air forces on Earth. By 1939, it fielded advanced fighters, efficient dive bombers, and a surprisingly large corps of well-trained pilots. Yet from the beginning, the Luftwaffe's strength was built on assumptions, and many of those assumptions were dangerously flawed. Germany's new air force was designed for short, decisive campaigns. The architects of blitzkrieg believed wars would be won quickly by fast-moving ground troops supported by swarms of dive bombers. They never anticipated a long war of attrition. They never planned for years of sustained industrial production, and they certainly never imagined they would face enemies capable of producing aircraft on a scale Germany could never match. Still, in 1939 and 1940, the Luftwaffe felt unstoppable. In Poland, their Stukas shattered troop columns and terrorized retreating forces. In Norway, they controlled the skis almost immediately. And during the invasion of France, Luftwaffe squadrons operated with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Their coordination with German armor was so tight that Allied commanders often felt as if the sky itself had turned against them. These early victories produced a dangerous illusion inside the German high command. The belief that the Luftwaffe was perfect. Inside the leadership circle, few questioned Goering's inflated reports. Few questioned the limited range of German fighters. Few questioned the lack of heavy bombers capable of strategic strikes. And as long as Germany kept winning, nobody felt the need to question anything at all. The Luftwaffe appeared invincible. But beneath the surface, cracks had already started to form. The training pipeline was short, giving pilots fewer hours than their British counterparts. Aircraft production was strong, but poorly coordinated. Dozens of competing designs, constant model revisions, and political favoritism created inefficiencies that would later cripple the entire system. Fuel consumption increased faster than Germany could produce or import it. And the rapid expansion of the Air Force meant thousands of inexperienced pilots were being pushed into cockpits far sooner than they should have been. Yet none of these problems seemed urgent, not yet. In 1940, as German troops marched into Paris, Goering boasted confidently that the Luftwaffe would soon force Britain to its knees. He believed the same aircraft that swept aside the French and Poles would overwhelm the Royal Air Force within weeks. It was a miscalculation of catastrophic proportions. Because while Germany celebrated its victories, Britain was preparing for a very different kind of war, a war of endurance, detection, and industrial output that the Luftwaffe was fundamentally unprepared to fight. And it was here, in the early summer of 1940, that the seeds of Germany's greatest air power failures began to take root, mistakes that would shape every phase of the conflict that followed. The stage was set for the Luftwaffe to face the first enemy it could not intimidate, outrun, or overwhelm. And that brings us to the second part of the background, the strategic environment Germany fatally misunderstood. By mid-1940, the strategic landscape Germany expected to dominate began shifting in ways the Luftwaffe was neither designed for nor prepared to understand. At the heart of these shifts was Britain, an island nation that refused to concede, even after watching Europe fall one country at a time. For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe faced an opponent it could not reach with blitzkrieg. Britain was not a continental neighbor, it could not be surrounded or cut off, and it could not be forced to negotiate by rapidly collapsing armies. If Germany wanted to break British resistance, it needed air superiority. That meant defeating the Royal Air Force completely. But Britain held a series of advantages the Luftwaffe leadership consistently dismissed. The most important of these was the chain-home radar network. Stretching along the coast like a silent wall of steel and electricity, it gave the RAF the ability to see incoming raids long before German formations reached the channel. While German reconnaissance spotted the tall radio masts, Goering assumed they were weather towers. No one inside the Luftwaffe command pushed hard to investigate further. This single intelligence failure shaped the entire Battle of Britain. Every time German fighters and bombers crossed the coast, RAF squadrons were already climbing to meet them. Every time the Luftwaffe shifted targets or timing, radar tracked it. What the Germans interpreted as uncanny luck was, in reality, a technological advantage they never understood. But even radar was only part of the equation. Britain also possessed something the Luftwaffe severely underestimated: industrial resilience. British factories dispersed production, shielded workers, and repaired aircraft at a rate that consistently surprised German planners. For every fighter the RAF lost, another rolled out of a hangar only hours later. Meanwhile, German aircraft manufacturing remained centralized, politically influenced, and poorly coordinated. Another critical German misjudgment lay in geography. The RAF was fighting over home territory. Downed pilots could often return to their squadrons the same day. German pilots, however, captured or lost over the channel, were gone forever. Every loss hit the Luftwaffe twice: a lost machine and an irreplaceable veteran. Despite these disadvantages, Goering remained confident. He insisted the enemy was closer to collapse than German intelligence reported. Pilot fatigue, mechanical wear, and the increasing pressure of sustained operations were ignored or downplayed. The Luftwaffe leadership believed the battle was a test of willpower, not logistics. They were wrong again. As the months wore on, it became clear that Germany's lightning war strategy had collided with a nation capable of absorbing punishment and continuing to fight. Britain's air defense system was built on layered detection, efficient command and control, and a steady, disciplined fighter force, the opposite of the Luftwaffe's fast strike, aggression-based doctrine. But this was not the only strategic miscalculation shaping the air war. When Germany turned east in 1941, launching Operation Barbarossa, the Luftwaffe expanded across a front so vast it dwarfed anything they faced before. Every aircraft flew greater distances, burned more fuel, and required more logistical support than Germany could sustainably provide. The Soviet Union, far from collapsing, mobilized factories beyond the reach of German bombers. While Luftwaffe units fought desperately to support advancing panzer armies, Soviet production surged. And as winter approached, aircraft that once dominated the skies suddenly struggled to survive the cold. Germany had envisioned a swift campaign. Instead, it entered a war of endurance it could neither supply nor reinforce. The Luftwaffe was now stretched between two fronts, a strategic disaster made worse by the leadership's refusal to acknowledge reality. The pilot training pipeline could not replace losses. Aircraft models multiplied unnecessarily. Fuel shortages worsened. The once modern Air Force was becoming overstretched, overworked, and increasingly outdated. This was the world the Luftwaffe entered after 1941, a world shaped not by quick victories, but by long-term pressures the German Air Force was never built to withstand. And to fully understand how these pressures shaped its downfall, we must examine the Luftwaffe from multiple angles, each revealing a different kind of blunder that pushed it closer to collapse. At the center of the Luftwaffe's failures stood a man whose influence shaped every major decision, Hermann Göring. Once celebrated as a decorated Great War fighter ace, by the 1930s he was no longer the sharp tactician the Luftwaffe needed. His leadership was built on loyalty to Hitler rather than strategic clarity, and his judgment, often clouded by arrogance, politics, and personal indulgence, proved disastrous. Göring surrounded himself with officers who rarely challenged him. Internal criticism was discouraged. Dissent was career-ending. The Luftwaffe became an echo chamber where overconfidence replaced honest assessment. Reports were routinely inflated to please Hitler, disguising losses, exaggerating victories, and masking the Air Force's growing vulnerabilities. There was also no unified doctrine. Göring refused to prioritize aircraft types, resulting in an uncoordinated patchwork of fighters, dive bombers, and medium bombers, none optimized for a long war. He rejected calls for a strategic bombing fleet, insisting fast campaigns made heavy bombers unnecessary. This single decision crippled Germany's ability to strike deep into enemy industry while leaving its own homeland exposed. Worst of all, Göring made emotional, impulsive decisions at critical moments. In the Battle of Britain, instead of maintaining pressure on RAF airfields, he shifted to bombing cities after a single retaliatory strike on Berlin, handing the RAF time to recover. Later, during the Stalingrad crisis, he promised Hitler an airlift the Luftwaffe could never deliver, sealing the fate of the encircled German Sixth Army. Leadership failures were not just mistakes. They were turning points that echoed throughout the war. The Luftwaffe entered the war with modern aircraft, but innovation stagnated precisely when Germany needed it most. Early designs like the Bf-109 and Ju-87 dominated the skies in 1939–40, but as the war expanded, their limitations became painfully clear. Germany never developed a four-engine strategic bomber fleet. While the United States and Britain sent heavy bombers deep into enemy territory, Germany relied almost entirely on medium bombers designed for close support, not long-range strikes. This meant German aircraft could not hit Soviet factories beyond the Urals, British industrial centers far inland, or American production later in the war. Jet technology, perhaps Germany's greatest advantage, was also mishandled. The Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, could have changed the air war had it been prioritized earlier. Instead, political interference, production delays, and Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber slowed deployment. By the time it reached the front in meaningful numbers, Allied forces already dominated the skies. Aircraft production was equally inefficient. Dozens of competing manufacturers introduced constant modifications, creating supply chaos. Spare parts became harder to manage, maintenance slowed, and pilots transitioning between similar aircraft often faced new controls or performance quirks. Technological potential existed, but leadership squandered it. Innovation became disunity, and disunity became defeat. Few enemies failed to understand their opponents as profoundly as the Luftwaffe misunderstood the RAF, Soviet industry, and later, Allied production. Intelligence failures began early and never stopped. The most famous mistake was dismissing British radar. The chain home system was the backbone of Britain's air defense, an early warning network that gave RAF commanders precious minutes to scramble interceptors. Despite identifying tall towers along the coast, German analysts misinterpreted them. Goering even ignored pilots who reported being tracked too quickly to be coincidence. The same blindness affected German assessments of Britain's aircraft output. Reports consistently underestimated British fighter production by wide margins. Even worse, German planners believed the RAF was down to its final reserve during the Battle of Britain, when in reality, Britain still had enough aircraft to sustain losses and continue fighting. In the East, the Luftwaffe severely underestimated Soviet strength. Intelligence predicted the USSR would collapse within months. No one imagined it could relocate entire factories to the Urals beyond Luftwaffe reach and produce more aircraft than Germany every single year of the war. The Americans were underestimated as well. Few in the Luftwaffe grasped the sheer scale of US industrial power until waves of B-17s and P-51s swept across the continent. These miscalculations shaped every major decision and every major defeat. Because you cannot win a war when you do not understand the enemy. In the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe's greatest strength was not its machines, it was its pilots. Veterans of the Condor Legion in Spain entered World War II with real combat experience. Their discipline, instinct, and aggressive tactics gave Germany an early edge. But this advantage came with a hidden weakness. The Luftwaffe had no long-term plan for replacing them. German pilot training before the war emphasized quality over quantity. Cadets received extensive flight hours, practiced advanced maneuvers, and trained in formation tactics that made them highly effective. But once the war expanded and casualties rose, the training pipeline became dangerously compressed. By 1942, training hours were cut drastically due to fuel shortages. By 1944, some pilots were entering combat with barely half the flight time required to be truly combat-ready. Meanwhile, the Allies went in the opposite direction. The United States and Britain built vast training networks across North America where fuel was abundant and skis were safe. Their pilots received more hours, more structure, and more standardized training than their German counterparts. The Luftwaffe's veterans were slowly ground down in battles of attrition over the Channel, over the steppes of Russia, and later over Germany itself. Once gone, they could not be replaced. Entire fighter wings that once dominated the air were reduced to shells of inexperienced recruits flying outdated aircraft. The Luftwaffe did not just lose machines. It lost the human core that made those machines powerful. Operationally, the Luftwaffe excelled in fast, coordinated strikes, but struggled when forced into prolonged, multi-front campaigns. Nowhere was this more evident than during the Battle of Britain. Initially, German attacks targeted RAF airfields and radar stations, the correct strategy. British Fighter Command was strained to near its breaking point. One more week of consistent pressure might have shattered the RAF's ability to defend its airspace. Instead, following a British bombing raid on Berlin, Hitler and Goering shifted to attacking cities. The Blitz was destructive, but strategically misguided. It allowed RAF squadrons precious time to recover, reorganize, and repair crucial infrastructure. What should have been a fatal blow to British air defense became one of Germany's greatest operational blunders. On the Eastern Front, the Luftwaffe faced an even more complex challenge. Supporting vast panzer spearheads meant flying enormous distances, operating from primitive airfields, and consuming fuel at unsustainable rates. German aircraft often arrived late to key engagements, and the skis became harder to control as Soviet fighter strength increased. Perhaps the most infamous operational failure came at Stalingrad. Goering promised Hitler the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled Sixth Army from the air, a promise completely disconnected from reality. Poor weather, inadequate aircraft numbers, and relentless Soviet attacks made the airlift impossible. Thousands of German soldiers starved or froze while waiting for supplies that would never arrive. Operational brilliance defined the Luftwaffe's early victories. Operational arrogance defined its defeats. Even the best aircraft and pilots are powerless without fuel, spare parts, and a steady stream of replacements. Yet Germany's industrial system was fragmented from the beginning. Multiple competing manufacturers fought for political favor, leading to inconsistent aircraft production and constant model variations that slowed maintenance. Albert Speer later streamlined production, but by the time central planning improved output, Allied bombers were already striking factories relentlessly. Each month, the Luftwaffe lost more aircraft than German industry could replace. Meanwhile, Allied factories, operating far from enemy reach, produced fighters and bombers at a rate that dwarfed anything Germany could achieve. Fuel was an even greater crisis. Germany relied heavily on synthetic fuel plants, which became prime targets for Allied raids. As fuel supplies dwindled, pilot training suffered, aircraft sat idle, and entire squadrons were grounded. By 1944, many Luftwaffe units were combat ineffective not because they lacked aircraft, but because they lacked fuel to fly them. Resources were also wasted on experimental or redundant projects. Dozens of prototypes soaked up manpower and raw materials that could have been used to build proven aircraft like the Bf-109 or FW-190 in greater numbers. Germany pursued technological novelty instead of strategic necessity. An air force cannot survive on innovation alone. It requires a stable industrial heartbeat, something the Luftwaffe never possessed. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was no longer the hunter. It was becoming the hunted. The decisive shift did not happen in a single battle, but one moment symbolized the irreversible change more clearly than any other: the arrival of long-range Allied escort fighters, especially the P-51 Mustang, over the heart of Germany. For the first years of the strategic bombing campaign, American B-17s and B-24s could only fly as far as their fighter escorts could reach. Beyond that limit, the bombers were exposed, and the Luftwaffe tore into them. The skies over Bremen, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg became killing grounds. German fighters dove through bomber formations with cannon fire shredding wings, engines, and fuselages. Casualties were severe enough that some questioned whether daylight bombing was sustainable. But then everything changed. In late 1943, Mustangs fitted with drop tanks began escorting bombers all the way to Berlin, something German command believed impossible. Their arrival transformed the air war. Suddenly, Luftwaffe fighters faced swarms of agile, fast, heavily armed escorts that outclimbed, outranged, and outmaneuvered most German aircraft. Veteran pilots described the shock of encountering these new adversaries deep over Germany, far beyond what they believed was the safe zone. The balance of power inverted almost overnight. Every time German fighters tried to attack the bomber formations, Mustang squadrons pounced from above. The Luftwaffe's interception tactics, perfected over years, began to fail. Losses rose sharply. Many were irreplaceable veterans. American bomber formations that once suffered heavy casualties now pushed deeper into German airspace with increasing confidence. While the Mustangs cut down fighters in the air, another threat rose from the horizon. Massive, relentless waves of Allied bombers striking German industry, fuel plants, transport hubs, and aircraft factories. These raids did more than destroy buildings. They dismantled the Luftwaffe's ability to function. Fuel production collapsed. Training slowed to a crawl. Supply chains fractured. Aircraft production became erratic and delayed. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting a battle it could no longer sustain. But the true breaking point came with one of the most brutal and decisive Allied air operations ever launched. In 6 days of concentrated attacks, Allied forces struck dozens of aircraft production centers across Germany. The goal was simple: cripple the Luftwaffe before the impending invasion of Western Europe. American 8th and 15th Air Forces attacked relentlessly, while RAF Bomber Command struck by night. Despite fierce resistance, German factories suffered catastrophic damage. Even worse for the Luftwaffe, they were forced into a battle of attrition, one they had no chance of winning. During Big Week alone, Germany lost hundreds of aircraft and many of its remaining experienced pilots. American losses were heavy too, but they could be replaced within days. The Luftwaffe could not replace anything not bombers, not fighters, not fuel, and not men. This moment marked a fundamental shift. After Big Week, the Luftwaffe was no longer capable of mounting sustained defensive operations across Germany. The skis that had once belonged to Göring's Air Force now belonged to the Allies. And as summer approached, the situation worsened even further. The Allied invasion of Normandy remains one of the most iconic moments of the war, but the near-total absence of the Luftwaffe over the beaches is just as significant. Out of an air force once counted in the thousands, only a handful of aircraft reached the landing zones. Those that did arrive were quickly overwhelmed by Allied fighters and anti-aircraft fire. For the German soldiers on the beaches, the absence was devastating. For Allied troops, it was a revelation. The Luftwaffe was no longer a factor in determining the outcome of the war. The invasion succeeded not only because of Allied strength, but because German air power had disintegrated. And yet the Air Force still had one final, desperate moment, a last attempt to turn the tide in the final year of the war. Germany's fatal over-reliance on elite aces. For most nations in WW2, air power was built on systems, training pipelines, standardized tactics, rotating squadrons, industrial support. But the Luftwaffe built its air force around heroes. Germany relied heavily on its super aces, men like Erich Hartmann, Gerhard Barkhorn, Günther Röhl, pilots whose kill counts went into the hundreds. Their skill was undeniable, their courage was unquestioned, but their strategic value was tragically misunderstood. Instead of creating a broad, sustainable pool of competent pilots, Germany created a handful of irreplaceable gods. Aces stayed in combat instead of training new pilots. Allied pilots with 5-10 victories were pulled from the front to become instructors. German pilots with 300 victories were kept in combat. This produced a brutal imbalance. The Allies produced thousands of new pilots every month. Germany produced bodies. New Luftwaffe pilots were barely trained. By 1944, flight hours dropped from 240 hours right arrow, less than 40 hours. Combat training, often 10 minutes of firing practice. Some pilots had only flown the Bf-109 in a straight line before going into battle. Meanwhile, American and British pilots trained for nearly a year before seeing combat. Losing an ace was a national disaster. Every time an experienced Luftwaffe ace was killed, years of irreplaceable experience were gone. Entire squadrons lost their tactical leadership. Morale collapsed. The Allies, however, rotated pilots, trained replacements, and never relied on a handful of superstars. The Luftwaffe built an air force around legends. The Allies built an air force around systems. And systems win wars. By early 1944, the war in the air had already shifted. But what happened next was something the Luftwaffe was never designed to survive. The Allies didn't just challenge German air power. They overwhelmed it, smothered it, and replaced the sky itself with an endless stream of metal. Allied intelligence made a chilling discovery. If Germany's fighter force died, the Reich would die with it. So the US launched Big Week, a wave of brutal daylight bombing campaigns that hit Germany's aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, and engine production lines. The Germans fought back fiercely, but every day they flew. They died a little faster. They destroyed some bombers, but they could not replace pilots, engines, or fuel. The Allies could. Long-range escorts arrive, the P-51 Mustang. This was the Luftwaffe's nightmare made real. It could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It was fast, high-altitude capable, and devastating in a dive. It hunted German fighters before they even reached the bombers. The Luftwaffe called it Der Tod aus dem Himmel, the death from the sky. By 1944, the Allies produced 96,000 aircraft per year. Germany produced less than 30,000. The math alone was fatal. For every German fighter that took off, 5 Allied fighters were already in the air. Luftwaffe airfields become death traps. Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Typhoons began patrolling Germany's skies relentlessly. Any German aircraft caught taking off or landing was destroyed instantly. Even training bases were hit. Pilots were killed before their first mission. By late 1944, German fighters flew without proper fuel. Engines overheated and failed. Pilots were 19-year-old rookies with no experience. Commanders lost radio contact due to shortages. Anti-aircraft guns ran out of shells. Factories were bombed faster than they could be rebuilt. The once fearsome Luftwaffe, the force that terrorized Europe in 1939, became a shadow of its former self. By 1945, the sky over Germany belonged entirely to the Allies. Pilots described it simply: the Luftwaffe wasn't defeated, it vanished. By 1944, Germany's last hope lay in technology. If numbers had failed, perhaps innovation could save the Luftwaffe. If pilots were dying, perhaps speed could compensate. If fuel was scarce, perhaps precision weapons could turn the tide. This hope was embodied in 2 main projects: the Me-262 jet fighter and experimental wonder weapons. The Me-262 was the fastest aircraft in the world. It could outrun any Allied fighter, climb higher, and deliver devastating cannon fire. Potential: intercept Allied bombers with minimal risk. Reduce Luftwaffe casualties dramatically. Regain air superiority in months. Reality: Hitler insisted it be used as a bomber first, delaying its fighter deployment. Production was hampered by Allied bombing and sabotage. Only a few hundred jets ever reached combat, far too few to impact the strategic situation. Fuel shortages and untrained pilots made even these elite machines partially ineffective. The Luftwaffe had technology that could have changed the air war. But mismanagement and desperation ensured it arrived too late. Germany also invested in revolutionary weapons: V-1 flying bombs, V-2 rockets, Me-262 bomber variants, advanced bomb guidance systems. The idea was to outpace the Allies with shock and awe. Production consumed scarce resources better spent on existing aircraft. Many of these weapons were inaccurate or logistically unsustainable. They could terrorize cities, but could not stop the steady march of Allied air supremacy. In effect, Germany bet the Luftwaffe's survival on miracles, not strategy. It was a gamble that failed spectacularly. Even for those flying the Me-262 or other wonder weapons, morale was fractured. Pilots knew fuel would run out mid-flight. Maintenance crews were exhausted, stretched thin across multiple locations. Every sortie carried extreme risk with little strategic gain. By the final months of the war, German pilots no longer fought for victory. They fought to survive. The Luftwaffe's technological edge existed on paper. But in reality, numbers, logistics, and poor planning rendered it irrelevant. Innovation arrived too late, in too small quantities, and under the weight of crippling logistical and strategic mistakes. The Luftwaffe could no longer protect Germany's skies. All that remained were desperate, heroic, but futile efforts to stem the inevitable. The collapse of the Luftwaffe and its immediate consequences. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a decisive force. What remained were fragmented units, scattered across multiple fronts fighting a war they could not win. Aircraft were destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons. Veteran pilots were dead, captured, or burned out, leaving only inexperienced rookies to fly increasingly obsolete machines. The Allied bombing campaigns had succeeded in their strategic goal. The skies above Germany were no longer contested. Factories lay in ruins, transportation networks were crippled, and synthetic fuel plants, once the backbone of German air power, were rendered unusable. Without air cover, German cities, railways, and frontline units were exposed to relentless attacks. The human cost was immense. Tens of thousands of Luftwaffe pilots had died over the course of the war. Those who survived often returned home physically and emotionally shattered, haunted by the knowledge that their sacrifices could not prevent defeat. Entire units were wiped out in a single operation, leaving gaping holes in Germany's air defense structure. The collapse of air power had immediate consequences on the battlefield. German ground forces, once supported by tight air-ground coordination, faced relentless Allied attacks with minimal aerial support. In the east, Soviet air forces began operating with near-total freedom, interdicting supply lines and supporting offensives that would push Germany back step by step. In the west, Allied air superiority allowed massive troop movements for the Normandy invasion and subsequent operations across France, Belgium, and into the Rhineland. The Luftwaffe's inability to protect German cities also had a profound psychological effect. Civilians lived under constant aerial bombardment. Morale plummeted. The German public, long convinced of the invincibility of their air force, now saw firsthand the consequences of decades of strategic miscalculations. Even within the military, the perception of invincibility had evaporated. Commanders who had relied on Luftwaffe support found themselves exposed and frustrated. Airfields that had once been bustling hubs of German air power were reduced to frozen, abandoned runways littered with wreckage. The notion that Germany could achieve total air dominance had become a distant memory. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer an offensive force. It could no longer project power or influence outcomes in major operations. It had become a defensive, reactive shell of its former self, a shadow of the force that had once struck fear across Europe. This collapse was not the result of a single failure, but a series of cumulative mistakes: leadership errors, technological mismanagement, intelligence miscalculations, operational missteps, inadequate pilot training, and industrial shortcomings. These combined failures ensured that by the war's final year, Germany's air force could no longer alter the course of events. The stage was now set for the final year of the war, in which the Luftwaffe would face its ultimate test, a relentless Allied advance from both east and west, with no hope of recovery. The long-term consequences and historical assessment. By 1945, the Luftwaffe had been reduced to a hollow shell, its glory days long behind it. Its collapse not only marked the end of Germany's ability to control the skies, but also exposed the broader vulnerabilities of a military built on flawed assumptions and overconfidence. Historians and military analysts have repeatedly pointed to the Luftwaffe as a cautionary tale. Technological superiority alone cannot sustain a war effort without sound leadership, logistics, and industrial support. The final months of the Luftwaffe's existence were characterized by desperation. Pilots flew missions with inadequate fuel, aircraft, and experience, often facing near-certain death against overwhelming Allied numbers. Even the most advanced planes, including the Me-262 jet fighters, were insufficient to reverse the tide. Strategic bombing continued largely unopposed, destroying what little infrastructure remained and further weakening Germany's ability to resist. Captured German commanders later testified that the Luftwaffe's failures were as much a product of internal politics as enemy action. Hermann Göring's interference in aircraft production, insistence on prioritizing vanity projects, and detachment from operational realities prevented the Luftwaffe from adapting to changing circumstances. Strategic errors at the command level, combined with intelligence failures and misreading Allied capacity, meant that by 1944, the German Air Force was fighting a battle it could never win. The consequences extended beyond the Luftwaffe itself. Ground operations suffered catastrophic losses without adequate air support. Key German cities were devastated by Allied bombing raids, while civilian morale plummeted under continuous aerial assault. The collapse of air defense contributed directly to the rapid advances of Allied forces in both the East and West, accelerating the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany. Post-war analyses have highlighted how the Luftwaffe's trajectory underscores the critical importance of sustainable pilot training, industrial consistency, and technological prioritization. While the Germans pioneered jet propulsion and advanced aircraft designs, these innovations arrived too late and in too limited numbers to have strategic effect. By contrast, the Allies combined industrial scale, pilot training, and evolving tactics to dominate the skies, illustrating that war is as much a contest of systems as of individual weapons or leaders. Ultimately, the Luftwaffe's downfall serves as a stark lesson in the interplay between strategy, technology, leadership, and logistics. Its story is not merely one of defeat in combat, but of how cumulative errors, unchecked overconfidence, and systemic shortcomings can erode even the most formidable military institution. As the war ended, the Luftwaffe was no longer a fearsome instrument of conquest, but a fragmented remnant, a stark reminder of how swiftly air superiority can vanish when vision, preparation, and execution falter. The story of the Luftwaffe is, above all, a story of hubris and miscalculation. What began as a symbol of German innovation and tactical brilliance ended as a cautionary tale about the fragility of even the most feared military force. Early victories masked deep structural flaws, over-reliance on elite pilots, mismanagement of technology, overconfidence in short campaigns, and disregard for industrial realities. These flaws, compounded over years, ultimately determined the Luftwaffe's fate more than any single battle or enemy action. For historians and strategists alike, the Luftwaffe demonstrates that air power cannot exist in isolation. Leadership decisions, production capacity, pilot training, and intelligence must all function as an integrated system. The Germans possessed brilliant machines, daring pilots, and innovative technology, yet their victories were fleeting because their air force lacked the endurance and adaptability to sustain long-term conflict. There is also a human dimension to consider. Thousands of pilots gave their lives, not in vain glory, but caught within the machinery of strategic failure. Cities were bombed, civilians terrorized, and entire generations of airmen were destroyed or traumatized. The Luftwaffe's story reminds us that the consequences of mismanaged military power extend far beyond the battlefield, affecting both the fate of nations and the lives of countless individuals. Finally, the Luftwaffe's collapse offers insight into the evolution of modern warfare. It highlights the importance of systems thinking, logistics, and industrial resilience in an age where technology alone cannot determine outcomes. The lessons drawn from Germany's mistakes informed post-war Air Force planning worldwide, a reminder that dominance in the sky is fleeting without foresight, flexibility, and sustained support. The skies over Europe once belonged to the Luftwaffe. By the end of the war, they belonged entirely to the Allies. In that transition, we see not just the fall of a military force, but a profound lesson about strategy, leadership, and the imperatives of adapting to reality. The Luftwaffe's biggest blunders were not isolated mistakes. They were a chain of decisions and failures that cumulatively reshaped the course of history, a testament to the fact that no power, however great, can withstand the consequences of its own misjudgments.